May's hands shook as she carefully set the skull back into its shallow grave of gravel, her archaeological training warring with every maternal instinct screaming at her to run. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her terror, and she pressed a palm against her belly in what had become an unconscious gesture of protection. The storage facility felt different now, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows that seemed to writhe and dance across the concrete floor. What had moments ago felt like salvation, a chance to dig her way out of financial ruin, now felt like a tomb. But May couldn't afford to walk away, not when David's gambling debts had already cost them everything else. She pulled out her phone to call the police, then hesitated. The screen showed 3 missed calls from First National Bank and a text from the mortgage company, final notice. Payment required by November 1st or foreclosure proceedings will begin 5 days. She had 5 days to save her home, and whatever was buried in this unit might be her only chance. May forced herself to think like the archaeologist she'd once been, before pregnancy and David's addictions had derailed everything she'd worked for. The pottery shards were definitely Blackfoot, probably dating back 3 centuries based on the firing patterns and clay composition. Authentic pieces like these could bring in serious money from collectors and museums, but the skull changed everything. The bone was too white, too well preserved to be ancient. The dental work visible in the upper jaw was modern, probably from the last decade. A rational person would call Sheriff Morrison and walk away, but May had stopped being rational the night she'd found David's suicide note 3 months ago, along with the credit card statements showing he'd gambled away not just their savings, but money borrowed against the house, the shop, even her grandmother's jewelry. The October wind picked up outside, whistling through gaps in the storage facility's walls. Cedar Falls had always been a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, but lately it felt different, smaller, more claustrophobic. People went missing here. May remembered the newspaper articles about vanished hikers, the construction worker who'd never come home, the college student whose car was found abandoned by the highway. Everyone assumed they'd moved on, seeking opportunities in bigger cities. Everyone except Sheriff Morrison, who'd seemed increasingly frustrated with cases that led nowhere. May knelt carefully beside the unit, her 7 months pregnant body making even simple movements awkward. She selected a brush from her old excavation kit, tools she'd kept despite selling almost everything else of value. The familiar weight of the brush in her hand was comforting, a connection to the woman she'd been before everything fell apart. Working methodically, she began clearing gravel from around the skull. The soil beneath was loose, deliberately disturbed, not the compressed earth she'd expect from natural burial. This was a dump site, carefully disguised but unmistakably intentional. As she worked, more bones emerged. Ribs, a femur, what looked like finger bones still bearing traces of decomposed fabric. The construction company label on the rental agreement read Hartwell Development, Building Cedar Falls Future. May knew the company. They'd been responsible for half the new subdivisions springing up around town. Their trucks were everywhere, carrying loads of gravel, dirt, and construction materials. The perfect cover for moving things that needed to disappear. Her phone buzzed with another call from the bank. May declined it, her mind racing. If she called the police now, they'd seal the unit as a crime scene. Any chance of salvaging those Native American artifacts, her chance to save the house, would vanish. But if she didn't call, she'd be tampering with evidence in what was clearly a murder case. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and May felt a sharp pain in her lower back. The stress wasn't good for either of them. She needed to make a decision and get out of this freezing storage unit before hypothermia set in. That's when she saw it, a glint of metal beneath the bones. Not Native American pottery this time, but something modern. A driver's license, the plastic warped but still legible. Sarah Chen, the University of Montana student who'd disappeared 2 years ago. Her photo had been plastered all over town for months before the search was quietly abandoned. May's breath misted in the cold air as the full scope of what she'd discovered began to sink in. This wasn't just a burial site, it was a body dump, and judging by the amount of gravel in the unit, Sarah Chen wasn't the only victim hidden here. The smart thing would be to walk away, call the police from a safe distance, and let them handle it. But as May looked around the storage facility, noting the security cameras, the locked gate, the isolated location, she realized something that chilled her more than the October wind. Whoever had rented this unit would know exactly who'd won it at auction. They'd know exactly who had discovered their secret, and they'd be coming for her. May's hands trembled as she carefully replaced the gravel over Sarah Chen's driver's license, her movements precise despite her fear. The archaeological training that had once mapped ancient civilizations now served a darker purpose, concealing evidence of modern horror. She couldn't afford to leave obvious signs of disturbance. Not yet. The drive back to town felt endless, her ancient Honda struggling against the October wind that howled across the Montana plains. Every headlight in her rearview mirror made her pulse spike. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. But as Cedar Falls' Main Street came into view, May forced herself to slip back into the routine that had sustained her through 3 months of barely controlled desperation. Blackwood Antiquities sat wedged between Miller's Hardware and a vacant storefront that used to house Sarah Chen's favorite coffee shop. The irony wasn't lost on May as she parked behind her shop, her hands still shaking from handling the dead girl's identification. The building had been her grandmother's bookstore once, back when Cedar Falls had enough young families to support such luxuries. Now it served as May's last stand against financial ruin, a cramped space filled with estate sale finds, consignment furniture, and the occasional genuine artifact that reminded her of the career she'd abandoned. The shop's back door stuck in the cold, requiring her full weight to force it open. The familiar smell of old wood and vanilla candles should have been comforting, but tonight it felt suffocating. May flicked on the lights, illuminating the organized chaos that had become her world. Inventory sheets scattered across the counter, unpaid bills rubber-banded by due date, a portable heater she couldn't afford to run humming in the corner. Her appointment book lay open to today's date, Wednesday, October 26th. Mrs. Patterson was coming tomorrow morning to look at the Victorian dining set May had spent last weekend refinishing. If she bought it, May could make the electric bill. If she didn't, May would be conducting business by candlelight. The baby rolled heavily in her belly, and May pressed both hands against the movement. "I know, sweet pea, Mama's scared too." She'd started talking to the baby more since David's death, filling the silence that threatened to swallow her whole. The doctor said it was normal, healthy even. What she didn't tell Dr. Reeves was that sometimes she imagined the baby responding, offering advice in David's voice about which pieces to buy, which customers to trust. May settled into the chair behind her counter and opened her laptop, the screen casting blue light across her tired features. Her browser bookmarks told the story of her desperation. Auction sites, estate sale listings, sell gold for cash advertisements. But tonight she opened a new tab and typed Sarah Chen missing Montana. The articles painted a familiar picture. Bright university student, studying environmental science. Last seen leaving the campus library on a Tuesday evening. Her car found 3 days later at a rest stop 20 miles east of town. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, no leads. The investigation had gone cold within months. May scrolled through the comments section, her heart breaking at the messages from Sarah's parents, her friends, her professors, people who'd loved her and never stopped hoping she'd come home. People who deserved answers May now possessed but couldn't safely share. The shop's front door chimed and May's blood froze. Through the curtained window, she could see a truck idling outside, big, dark, with Hartwell Development's logo barely visible in the streetlight's glow. Her laptop screen reflected in the glass, and May realized anyone outside could see exactly what she was researching. She slammed the computer shut and moved toward the back room, but the footsteps on the front porch had already stopped. A moment later, the truck's engine started up again, and red taillights disappeared down Main Street. May's legs gave out, and she sank into her chair as the full weight of her situation crashed over her. She was 7 months pregnant, broke and alone in a town where a killer was watching her every move. The smart thing would be to pack what she could carry and disappear into the night. But where could she go? She had $43 in her checking account and a car that might not make it to the county line. More than that, this was her home. The house where she'd planned to raise her baby was 2 blocks away, its nursery half painted in pale yellow because she couldn't afford to find out the gender. Her grandmother's rocking chair sat by the window, waiting for late-night feedings and whispered lullabies. The apple tree in the backyard still bore fruit from seeds her great-grandfather had planted in 1943. May pulled out her phone and stared at Sheriff Morrison's number. One call could end this nightmare, but it would also end any chance of saving her home. The Native American artifacts in that storage unit represented more than money. They were her expertise, her connection to the life she'd built before everything fell apart. She thought about Sarah Chen's parents, still hoping their daughter might walk through their door. Then she thought about her own child, who deserved more than a mother too frightened to fight for their future. The baby kicked again, gentler this time, and May made her choice. May stared at her phone for another long moment, Sheriff Morrison's contact glowing on the screen. Her thumb hovered over the call button, as her other hand traced protective circles over her belly. The smart choice was obvious. The safe choice was clear. But May Blackwood had stopped making safe choices the night she'd decided to keep fighting for a life that seemed determined to crumble around her. She set the phone aside and opened her laptop again, this time navigating to the University of Montana's Archaeology Department website. If she was going to do this, if she was really going to extract those Native American artifacts before calling in the discovery, she needed backup documentation, professional credibility that would justify her presence at what would inevitably become a crime scene. The department's faculty page loaded slowly, her shop's ancient internet connection struggling against the October storm that was building outside. There, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, her former advisor, still listed as Director of Regional Archaeological Studies, the woman who'd tried to convince May not to leave the program when David's addictions first started affecting her work. The woman who'd said May had the best eye for contextual analysis she'd seen in 20 years. May's fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Reaching out to Dr. Rodriguez meant admitting how far she'd fallen, acknowledging that the promising graduate student who'd once mapped pre-Columbian trade routes was now desperately digging through gravel in a storage unit. But it also meant having academic authority on her side when questions inevitably came. Before she could second-guess herself, May typed quickly. Dr. Rodriguez, this is May Blackwood, formerly May Sullivan. I've made a significant discovery of Blackfoot artifacts in Cedar Falls that requires immediate documentation. The circumstances are complex, but the find could be extraordinary. Can you drive up tomorrow morning? I need someone with academic credentials present before I contact local authorities. May. She hit send before she could change her mind, then immediately opened a new browser tab to research everything she could about Hartwell Development. The company's website was slick, professional, full of aerial photos showing Cedar Falls' suburban expansion. Building communities, preserving heritage, their tagline read, which would have been grimly ironic if May hadn't been so terrified. The team page showed a familiar face, Robert Hartwell, owner and founder, his photo capturing the weathered features of a man who'd spent decades in construction. May recognized him from around town. He was a fixture at city council meetings, church fundraisers, the kind of local businessman who sponsored Little League teams and had his name on half the benches in Riverside Park. His bio mentioned 30 years of experience, projects throughout the Montana region, and a commitment to respecting the land while building the future. A soft knock at the shop's back door made May's heart slam against her ribs. She closed the laptop again and grabbed a letter opener from her desk drawer. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. The knock came again, gentle but persistent. May? It's Betty Morrison. I saw your lights on. May's relief was so profound she almost cried. Betty Morrison, the sheriff's wife, was one of the few people in town who'd shown May genuine kindness since David's suicide. She unlocked the door to find the older woman standing under the back porch light, holding a covered casserole dish and wearing a concerned expression. "I brought you some of that chicken and rice you liked," Betty said, stepping inside without invitation. "And I wanted to check on you. Jim's been worried." Sheriff Morrison had been David's poker buddy before everything went wrong, and May knew he still felt guilty about not recognizing the signs earlier. "I'm fine, Betty. Just working late." Betty's sharp eyes took in the laptop, the scattered papers, May's obvious exhaustion. She'd raised 4 children and buried a son in Afghanistan. She could read trouble from a mile away. "Honey, you look like you've seen a ghost. What's going on?" For a moment, May considered telling her everything. Betty Morrison was the kind of woman who could keep secrets and solve problems with equal efficiency. But involving her meant involving her husband, and May wasn't ready for that conversation yet. "I bought a storage unit today," May said carefully. "Found some interesting artifacts that might help with the mortgage situation. I'm just trying to research their value before I get my hopes up." Betty's expression softened. "That's wonderful, dear. What kind of artifacts?" "Native American pottery, possibly Blackfoot, maybe 18th century. All true as far as it went." "Well, that does sound promising." Betty squeezed May's shoulder. "But you need to be careful not to overdo things. That baby needs you to stay healthy." As if summoned by her words, the baby kicked forcefully enough to make May wince. Betty noticed immediately, her maternal instincts still sharp despite her children being grown. "When's your next appointment with Dr. Reeves?" "Friday morning." May managed a smile that felt more natural. "We're doing fine, Betty, really." Betty studied her for another moment, then nodded. "All right, but you call me if you need anything, and I mean anything, May, day or night." After Betty left, May locked the door and leaned against it, the weight of her deception settling heavily on her shoulders. Tomorrow, Dr. Rodriguez would arrive. Tomorrow she'd return to the storage unit and document everything properly before making the call that would change Cedar Falls forever. Tonight she had casserole and one last evening of ordinary life before everything exploded. May stood in her darkened kitchen at 2 a.m, Betty Morrison's casserole cold and untouched on the counter. Sleep had proven impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Sarah Chen's warped driver's license photo staring back at her from beneath tons of gravel. The baby moved restlessly in her belly, as if sensing her turmoil, and May pressed her hand against the spot where tiny feet drummed against her ribs. "What am I doing?" she whispered to the empty house. Her laptop sat open on the kitchen table, Dr. Rodriguez's response glowing on the screen. The email had arrived an hour ago. "May, I'll be there by 9 a.m. This better be worth risking my tenure. Elena." 24 hours ago, May's biggest worry had been making the electric bill. Now she was planning to extract priceless artifacts from what was essentially a mass grave, putting both herself and her former mentor at risk. The rational part of her mind, the part that had always excelled at risk assessment in archaeological fieldwork, screamed that she should call Sheriff Morrison immediately. But rationality was a luxury she couldn't afford. May pulled up her bank account on her phone, staring at the numbers that had haunted her for months. Negative $127 in checking. The mortgage payment was due in 6 days, and without it, the foreclosure proceedings would begin. David's life insurance had been nullified by suicide, and his gambling debts had consumed everything else. The house, her grandmother's house, where 4 generations of women had raised their children, would be gone by Christmas. The Native American pottery in that storage unit could change everything. Pre-contact Blackfoot ceramics, especially burial goods, could fetch substantial prices from legitimate collectors. Museums paid handsomely for properly documented finds. Even if she could only recover a fraction of the artifacts before the police sealed the scene, it might be enough to keep her home. But extracting anything meant returning to that storage unit. It meant facing the possibility that whoever had dumped those bodies might be watching, waiting to see what the pregnant woman who'd bought their secret might do next. The image of the Hartwell development truck outside her shop played on repeat in her mind. May walked to the living room window and peered through the curtains at the street beyond. Main Street was empty except for a stray dog nosing through garbage near the defunct coffee shop. Normal, peaceful, but normalcy felt like a facade now, a thin veneer covering something rotten beneath. The baby kicked hard enough to make her gasp, and May felt a familiar tightening across her abdomen. Braxton Hicks contractions, her body practicing for labor still months away. Dr. Reeves had warned her about stress, about how anxiety could trigger early labor. "That baby needs you to stay calm," he'd said during her last appointment. "Whatever problems you're facing, they're not worth risking your pregnancy." What would happen to her child if she miscalculated? If whoever had killed Sarah Chen decided a pregnant witness was too dangerous to leave alive? May had no family left except the baby growing inside her, no support system beyond the grudging kindness of neighbors like Betty Morrison. If something happened to her, would anyone even know to look for them? She thought about David then, about the note he'd left apologizing for destroying their future. "I can't fix what I've broken," he'd written in his careful handwriting. "Maybe you can start over without me dragging you down." He'd believed his death would free her from his mistakes, but all he'd done was trap her in a different kind of prison. The baby settled as May rubbed her belly, the movement gentler now. "Your daddy thought he was protecting us," she murmured. "Maybe I'm making the same mistake." But David's problem had been that he couldn't stop taking risks, couldn't resist the promise of easy money even when the odds were stacked against him. May's risk was different, calculated, purposeful. She wasn't gambling, she was fighting. Fighting for the home where her child would take first steps, speak first words, grow up surrounded by family history and love. The storage unit held more than artifacts and bodies. It held her future, wrapped in ancient clay and buried beneath the evidence of someone else's crimes. Walking away meant accepting defeat, admitting that David's final gamble had cost them everything. Staying meant facing whatever came next with the tools she'd learned during years of careful excavation, patience, precision, and the stubborn refusal to abandon a dig just because it got dangerous. May closed the laptop and made her decision for the second time in 12 hours. Tomorrow, she would meet Dr. Rodriguez at the storage facility. Together, they would document the Native American remains with academic precision, providing legal justification for their presence at what would become a crime scene. Then, and only then, would she call Sheriff Morrison. She had approximately 8 hours to figure out how to do all of this without getting herself killed. May woke before dawn with the taste of copper in her mouth and her heart hammering against her ribs. The nightmare had been vivid, Robert Hartwell standing over her grandmother's grave, explaining how easy it would be to add one more body to his collection. She pressed her palms against her belly, feeling the baby's reassuring movement as pale October light crept through the bedroom curtains. There was no going back now. Dr. Rodriguez would arrive in 4 hours, expecting to document legitimate archaeological finds. May had 3 hours to prepare for what might be the last excavation of her career or the last day of her life. She dressed carefully in layers, her maternity jeans tight across her expanding waist. The old field vest she'd worn during graduate digs barely zipped over her belly, its pockets heavy with the tools she'd cleaned and organized before attempting sleep: trowels, brushes, measuring tape, sample bags. The familiar weight of archaeological equipment felt like armor against the unknown. In the kitchen, she forced herself to eat Betty's leftover casserole, knowing she'd need energy for whatever came next. The baby responded to the food with gentle rolls, and May found herself talking aloud again. "We're going to be okay, sweet pea. Mama knows what she's doing." The words felt like a prayer rather than reassurance. At 7:30, May loaded her truck with additional supplies from the shop's back room: a portable generator she'd bought for estate sales in remote locations, floodlights powerful enough to illuminate entire basements, and a collapsible work table she used for delicate restorations. Anyone watching would see a pregnant antique dealer preparing for a routine acquisition. They wouldn't see the archaeological documentation forms hidden beneath inventory sheets or the camera equipment wrapped in moving blankets. The drive to Cedar Falls storage felt different in daylight. Yesterday's journey of desperate hope had transformed into something else entirely, a deliberate march toward consequences she couldn't fully anticipate. May parked behind the facility's main building, out of sight from the road, and waited in the truck's warmth as her breath fogged the windows. Dr. Elena Rodriguez arrived precisely at 9 a.m., her university Range Rover looking pristine against the storage facility's weathered facade. May watched her former mentor emerge from the vehicle, still tall and sharp-eyed at 60, her graying hair pulled back in the practical bun May remembered from countless field seasons. She carried herself with the authority of someone who'd spent decades extracting secrets from unwilling ground. May. Dr. Rodriguez's greeting was cautiously warm as they met beside the storage units. "You look—" She paused, taking in May's obvious pregnancy, the exhaustion evident despite carefully applied makeup. "Different. It's been a complicated few years." May unlocked Unit 17, her hands steadier than she'd expected. "Thank you for coming. I know this was short notice." "Your email was intriguing." Dr. Rodriguez followed her into the unit, professional curiosity overriding personal concern. Blackfoot burial goods would be significant, especially if they're pre-contact. "But May, you know the protocols for human remains, if there are bodies involved." "There are bodies." May's voice came out flat, matter-of-fact. "But not just Native American ones. That's why I need academic documentation before I contact law enforcement." Dr. Rodriguez stopped moving, her experienced gaze taking in the artificial landscape of gravel, the careful organization May had imposed on chaos. "Explain." May began talking, her voice gaining strength as she outlined everything she'd discovered. The pottery shards that had led her deeper into the unit, the burial chamber with its careful arrangement of artifacts and remains, the driver's licenses belonging to missing persons, the connection to Hartwell development through the unit's rental history. As she spoke, May watched her former mentor's expression shift from skepticism to understanding to professional excitement, warring with moral horror. Dr. Rodriguez knelt beside the areas May had excavated, her trained eyes cataloguing details May had missed in yesterday's panicked discovery. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Rodriguez murmured, photographing the exposed pottery with practiced efficiency. "The preservation is remarkable. These artifacts could rewrite regional chronologies." She paused, looking up at May with concern. "And you're certain about the modern remains?" May showed her the license photos, watching Dr. Rodriguez's face pale as the implications sank in. "We have perhaps 2 hours before I need to call Sheriff Morrison," May said. "I need official documentation that these Native American remains require professional excavation, legal justification for our presence here when this becomes a crime scene." Dr. Rodriguez was quiet for several minutes, her academic mind weighing ethics against opportunity. Finally, she nodded. "We document everything, photograph the artifacts in situ, establish proper grid coordinates, collect samples for dating analysis. When the police arrive, they'll find a legitimate archaeological investigation, not treasure hunters disturbing evidence." May felt something tight in her chest finally loosen. "You're staying?" "You found something important, May, both archaeologically and criminally. We're going to do this right." Dr. Rodriguez began unpacking her equipment with practiced efficiency. "But first, you're going to tell me why you're really doing this. And don't say it's just about the artifacts." May looked around the storage unit that had become her crossing point, from desperate widow to something harder, more purposeful, from victim of David's choices to architect of her own survival. The baby moved in her belly, and she placed her hand over the spot protectively. "Because some secrets are worth the risk," she said finally. "And because I'm done running from fights I didn't start." Dr. Rodriguez's equipment transformed the cramped storage unit into a professional excavation site within 30 minutes. As May watched her former mentor work, memories of graduate fieldwork flooded back. The methodical precision, the careful documentation, the electric anticipation of uncovering something significant. But this dig carried stakes no university project had ever matched. Grid established, Dr. Rodriguez announced, stretching yellow string between metal stakes driven into the gravel. We'll work in quarter-meter squares, photograph everything in situ before removal. She glanced at May's protruding belly with concern. You shouldn't be doing heavy lifting in your condition. I'm 7 months pregnant, not made of glass. May adjusted her position carefully, kneeling beside the exposed pottery. Besides, you'll need someone who knows the site's stratigraphy. As they began the delicate process of excavation, May found herself falling back into the rhythm that had once defined her life. Brush away sediment grain by grain, photograph from multiple angles, record measurements and soil conditions. The familiar motions steadied her nerves even as her lower back ached from the awkward positioning her pregnancy required. Remarkable preservation, Dr. Rodriguez murmured, exposing the rim of what appeared to be a ceremonial vessel. The gravel actually protected the artifacts from environmental fluctuation, inadvertent conservation. May was documenting the vessel's position when her phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. Saw your truck at the storage place. Careful digging too deep. Some things should stay buried. Ice water seemed to replace the blood in May's veins. She showed Dr. Rodriguez the message, watching her mentor's professional excitement shift to alarm. We need to call the police now, Dr. Rodriguez said, setting down her brush. This isn't worth our lives. 5 more minutes. May's voice came out steadier than she felt. Look at this pottery sequence. We're seeing cultural layers that span centuries. If the police cordon off this site before we document the archaeological significance, these artifacts could disappear into evidence storage forever. Dr. Rodriguez hesitated, and May pressed her advantage. You know how crime scene processing works. They'll focus on the modern remains, bag everything else as potential evidence. No context preservation, no professional analysis. This could be the most significant Plains Indian site discovered in decades. Another text arrived last warning. May's hands trembled as she photographed the message, but she didn't stop working. The baby kicked forcefully, as if protesting the tension radiating through May's body, but she couldn't afford to slow down now. Each artifact they documented was potential evidence of both ancient culture and modern crimes, and potential salvation for her financial situation. There, Dr. Rodriguez said, carefully lifting a nearly complete bowl from the gravel. Pre-contact manufacture, definitely Blackfoot based on the rim decoration. This piece alone could be worth $20,000 to the right collector. May felt a surge of desperate hope. $20,000 would cover the mortgage and buy her time to figure out longer-term solutions. But as she reached for her camera to document the bowl's removal, footsteps crunched on gravel outside the storage unit. Both women froze. The footsteps were deliberate, unhurried, someone who belonged here or wanted to appear as if they did. May's grip tightened on the trowel in her hand, its metal edge suddenly feeling inadequate against whatever threat approached. "Morning, ladies." The voice was familiar, friendly even. Robert Hartwell stepped into view at the unit's entrance, his weathered face arranged in an expression of neighborly concern. "Heard there might be some interesting discoveries happening out here." Dr. Rodriguez moved protectively closer to May, her body language shifting from academic excitement to maternal defensiveness. "Mr. Hartwell, this is a closed archaeological excavation." "Oh, I'm sure it is." Hartwell's gaze moved over their equipment, their careful documentation, the exposed artifacts. "Thing is, this particular unit has some history. Previous renter left behind quite a mess that needed cleaning up. Hate to see anyone get caught up in old business that doesn't concern them." May forced herself to meet his eyes, channeling every ounce of authority she'd learned during years of dealing with skeptical landowners and hostile bureaucrats. These artifacts fall under state archaeological protection laws. Any interference would constitute a federal crime. Hartwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. Artifacts, sure. But sometimes people dig up more than they bargained for. Sometimes they find things that put them in danger. His attention fixed on May's belly, especially when they have so much to lose. The threat was clear, even wrapped in false concern. May felt Dr. Rodriguez tense beside her and realized her mentor was calculating distances to the truck, to help, to safety. But running would mean abandoning everything they'd worked to document, everything that might save May's home and expose Hartwell's crimes. "We're documenting legitimate archaeological finds," May said, her voice carrying the confidence she'd learned from presenting research to hostile academic committees. "In 2 hours, Sheriff Morrison will receive a full report on both the cultural remains and the modern evidence we've uncovered." Hartwell's expression hardened. 2 hours is a long time. A lot can happen in 2 hours. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, thick with unspoken threats and calculations. May could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, drowning out everything except the soft scrape of gravel under Hartwell's boots as he shifted his weight. The baby moved restlessly in her belly, responding to her spiking adrenaline. "Dr. Rodriguez," May said quietly, never breaking eye contact with Hartwell, "please continue photographing the artifacts. We have documentation to complete." Her mentor hesitated, understanding the subtext. "Keep working. Don't show fear. Act like we belong here more than he does." Hartwell chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. Brave words from someone in such a delicate condition. "Your husband understood the importance of knowing when to walk away from a bad situation. Eventually." The reference to David hit like a physical blow. May's free hand instinctively moved to her belly, and she saw Hartwell's eyes follow the gesture with predatory satisfaction. He knew about David's suicide, knew about her desperation, her isolation, her vulnerability. "David's gambling debts have nothing to do with archaeological lore," May managed, though her voice came out thinner than she'd intended. "Don't they?" Hartwell stepped deeper into the unit, forcing both women to crane their necks to maintain eye contact. "See desperate people make poor decisions, start digging where they shouldn't, disturbing things that were properly buried. Sometimes they convince themselves they're being heroic when they're really just being foolish." Dr. Rodriguez had resumed photographing, her camera's rapid clicks providing a steady counterpoint to the mounting tension. May realized her mentor was creating a record not just of artifacts, but of this confrontation, timestamps that would establish Hartwell's presence, his threats, his awareness of what they'd discovered. "The university has a full record of our excavation permit," Dr. Rodriguez said without looking up from her camera, "including GPS coordinates and estimated completion time. My graduate students expect regular check-ins." It was a bluff, May could tell from the slight tremor in her mentor's voice, but a good one. Establish accountability, create witnesses, make it clear that their disappearance would be noticed, investigated, avenged. Hartwell's expression shifted, annoyance flickering across his weathered features. "Universities," he said with disgust, "always complicating simple situations. This used to be a community that understood how to handle local problems locally." May felt something cold settle in her stomach. The casual way he spoke about handling problems suggested this wasn't his first time making people disappear. How many others had stood where she was standing now, realizing too late that they'd uncovered something deadly? "The artifacts we've documented span multiple cultural periods," May said, forcing academic authority into her voice. "This site will require months of proper excavation. The State Archaeological Commission will need to establish a formal dig." "No." Hartwell's voice carried absolute finality. "This site will require cleanup. Again, some people never learn that there are consequences for sticking their noses where they don't belong." The baby kicked hard enough to make May gasp, and she felt that familiar tightening across her abdomen. Stress-induced contractions, her body's warning that her pregnancy couldn't handle much more of this confrontation. She pressed her hand against the spot, trying to calm both herself and the child who depended on her survival. Dr. Rodriguez caught the movement and straightened, maternal protectiveness overriding professional caution. "Mr. Hartwell, this conversation is over. May needs to get off her feet, and we need to complete our documentation." If you have concerns about our permit, contact the university's archaeological department. I have concerns about a lot of things, Hartwell replied, his attention shifting between the two women like a predator choosing between prey. Like why a pregnant woman with money troubles would suddenly develop such expensive interests. Like why missing persons cases keep intersecting with construction projects. Like whether some secrets are worth dying for. The last phrase hung in the air like smoke, and May realized he was parroting her own words back at her. Had he been listening to their conversations, monitoring their phones? The storage facility's isolation suddenly felt absolute. No witnesses, no help, no escape routes that wouldn't require, abandoning everything they'd worked to preserve. 2 hours, May repeated, though her voice barely carried across the space between them. Sheriff Morrison expects our call in 2 hours. Hartwell smiled then, genuinely amused. Betty Morrison's boy? He's a good kid, but he's got a lot to learn about how things work around here. About which problems require careful handling and which ones. He shrugged, the gesture somehow more threatening than any direct threat could have been. May felt Dr. Rodriguez's hand touch her shoulder, a steadying presence that reminded her she wasn't facing this alone. They had documentation now, evidence that would outlast whatever Hartwell planned. The artifacts lay exposed between them like ancient witnesses, patient guardians of truths both old and new. The baby settled as May's breathing steadied, and she understood with crystalline clarity that this moment would define everything that came after. Fight or flight, trust or surrender. The choice her husband had been unable to make now belonged to her. May's grip tightened on the trowel until her knuckles went white, the metal tool's weight a fragile comfort against the enormity of what she faced. Hartwell's smile widened as he noticed the gesture, and she realized with sick clarity that he found her defiance amusing rather than threatening. A pregnant woman with a gardening tool against a man who'd spent decades burying his mistakes. Smart choice, hanging on to something sharp, Hartwell said conversationally, stepping further into the unit. Though I have to wonder if you've really thought this through. Fighting for artifacts when you should be thinking about that baby. The casual cruelty of using her pregnancy as leverage sent rage coursing through May's veins. This was her greatest fear made manifest, not just death, but leaving her child orphaned before it even drew breath. David had abandoned them through suicide. Now she faced a man who would murder them outright. Dr. Rodriguez, May said steadily, please send those photos to the university servers now. Her mentor's fingers moved quickly across her phone screen, uploading their documentation to multiple cloud accounts. Each transmitted image was evidence that would survive them, testimony that would speak from beyond, whatever grave Hartwell had planned. Technology, Hartwell sighed, pulling a phone from his pocket. Makes everything so complicated. His thumbs moved across the screen with practiced efficiency. Good thing there are still people who understand that some problems require old-fashioned solutions. Within seconds, May heard the distant rumble of a truck engine growing closer. Backup arriving, just as she'd feared. Her archaeological training kicked in, cataloguing escape routes and defensive positions with the same methodical precision she'd once used to map dig sites. The storage unit's narrow entrance created a choke point, advantageous for defense but catastrophic for retreat. Dr. Rodriguez moved protectively closer, and May realized her mentor was calculating the same tactical realities. 2 women, one heavily pregnant, against armed men in an isolated location. The mathematics were brutally simple. You made a mistake, May said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. You assumed I was like David. Someone who would crumble under pressure, make desperate choices, disappear quietly when things got difficult. Hartwell's eyebrows rose with genuine curiosity. And you're different how exactly? I'm an archaeologist. May shifted her weight, feeling the baby respond to her movement with sharp kicks that reminded her what she was fighting for. I've spent my career digging up secrets that people tried to bury forever. I understand that evidence always survives, no matter how deep you hide it. The truck engine cut off nearby, Footsteps approaching through gravel. May counted at least 2 sets, possibly 3. Her mouth went dry as she realized how thoroughly Hartwell had planned this confrontation. This wasn't improvised violence, it was practiced elimination. "Evidence requires witnesses," Hartwell replied mildly, "and witnesses require survival." Dr. Rodriguez's hand found May's shoulder, squeezing gently. "The photos are uploaded," she murmured. "GPS coordinates, timestamps, everything." May nodded, understanding the gift her mentor had just given them. Even if they didn't survive the next hour, their discoveries would. The artifacts would be recovered, the burial sites properly excavated, the missing persons identified. Their deaths would have meaning beyond Hartwell's ability to control. The realization brought unexpected calm. May had lived the past months consumed by David's failures, drowning in his debts and poor choices. But this moment belonged entirely to her, her discovery, her courage, her decision to fight rather than flee. The baby she carried would either inherit that legacy of resistance or be remembered as its innocent casualty. "How many others?" May asked, genuine curiosity cutting through her fear. "How many people have stood where I'm standing now?" Hartwell's expression flickered with something like respect. "Enough to teach me patience. Most people break before they get this far, start begging, offering deals, promising silence in exchange for their lives." He studied May's face with clinical interest. "You're not going to beg, are you?" "No." May felt the truth of it settle in her bones. "I'm going to make you work for this. Every step, every choice, every moment you spend cleaning up your mistakes. I'm going to make it cost you something." The baby kicked again, a strong flutter that reminded May of everything she was protecting. Not just her own survival, but the future her child deserved. A world where men like Hartwell didn't bury their crimes beneath progress and intimidation. Dr. Rodriguez raised her camera again, focusing not on artifacts but on Hartwell's face. "Smile," she said quietly. "You're about to be famous." The footsteps outside grew closer, but May no longer felt the paralyzing terror that had gripped her moments before. She understood now what David had never learned, that some fights were worth the cost, even when the outcome remained uncertain, especially then. Her greatest fear hadn't been death after all. It had been powerlessness, becoming another victim of circumstances beyond her control. But standing in this storage unit surrounded by ancient witnesses to human endurance, May finally understood the difference between survival and surrender. The ordeal was just beginning, but she would meet it on her own terms. The first shadow appeared at the storage unit's entrance before May could fully process Hartwell's signal. A man she didn't recognize, broad-shouldered and moving with the careful efficiency of someone accustomed to violence. Behind him, another figure, this one familiar from town council meetings, the bank, places where respectable Cedar Falls conducted business in daylight. May's newfound resolve wavered as the reality of their situation crystallized. These weren't desperate criminals making panicked decisions. This was an organized operation, methodical elimination disguised as community problem-solving. "Dr. Rodriguez," the newcomer said politely, tipping his baseball cap. "Ma'am, hate to interrupt your work, but Mr. Hartwell says there's been some confusion about property rights." May watched her mentor's face pale as recognition dawned. "Jim Carlson, you're supposed to be fishing in Glacier this week." Plans change. Carlson's attention shifted to May with uncomfortable intensity, especially when old problems start surfacing in new places. The casual familiarity between them shattered May's remaining illusions about finding help in Cedar Falls. If Carlson was involved, a man Dr. Rodriguez trusted enough to know his vacation schedule, then Hartwell's network ran deeper than she'd imagined. How many others? How many supposedly upstanding citizens participated in these old-fashioned solutions? Her phone buzzed with an incoming text. May glanced down instinctively, hope flaring that someone had noticed their absence. Instead, David's contact photo filled her screen with a message that made her blood freeze. "Stop digging or join me." Impossible. David was dead. buried 3 months ago after his body was pulled from Glacier Creek. But the message had come from his number, from the phone she'd been unable to cancel because she couldn't afford the termination fee. Technology, Hartwell said again, watching May's reaction with satisfaction. So easy to spoof these days. Though I have to admit, using your dead husband's phone was Jim's idea. He thought it might provide the right psychological motivation. May felt something break inside her chest, not her resolve, but her last connection to the man she'd married. David's memory, already tainted by his gambling and suicide, was now a weapon turned against their unborn child. The violation was complete, unforgivable. Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward, placing herself between May and the men. This has gone far enough. May is 7 months pregnant. Whatever business you think you have here, she's not part of it. Respectfully, Dr. Rodriguez, that's not your decision to make. Carlson pulled out a folded document, official-looking and legal-sized. This storage unit was rented using fraudulent identification. The real owner has requested immediate reclamation of his property. May's heart sank as she recognized the implications. Legal cover, paperwork that would justify their presence and explain away any evidence of struggle. Her archaeological training had taught her to look for patterns in seemingly random data, and the pattern here was devastatingly clear. They'd walked into a trap that had been decades in the making. The artifacts. May started. What artifacts? Hartwell spread his hands in apparent confusion. I see gravel, construction material that was improperly stored and needs removal for safety reasons. His gaze fixed on her belly with mock concern. Pregnant women shouldn't be crawling around in dirty storage units anyway. Bad for the baby. The baby. May's hand moved instinctively to her abdomen, feeling the familiar weight that had become both burden and blessing over these long months. David's child, but also hers, the future she'd been fighting to protect, to provide for, to bring into a world worth inhabiting. Dr. Rodriguez's camera lay forgotten in the gravel beside the pottery shards they'd so carefully documented. Hours of work, evidence of both ancient culture and modern crimes, reduced to meaningless debris by men who understood that history belonged to whoever controlled the present narrative. The university knows we're here, Dr. Rodriguez said desperately. My students expect... Your students think you're helping a former colleague with a personal project. Carlson's voice carried genuine regret. I called the department this morning, explained that May was having some emotional difficulties related to her husband's death, asked them not to worry if your check-ins were delayed. May felt the last of her hope crumble. They'd been isolated so completely that even their allies had been turned into accomplices, unwitting participants in their own abandonment. The careful documentation, the uploaded photos, the GPS coordinates, all meaningless if no one came looking because no one expected to find them missing. The baby kicked weakly as if sensing her despair, and May realized with crystalline horror that she was about to lose everything: her life, her child, her chance to expose the truth, her final opportunity to prove that David's death hadn't been in vain. Hartwell stepped closer, his shadow falling across the artifacts that had promised salvation just hours before. Now then, he said gently, let's discuss how to resolve this situation with minimum fuss for everyone involved. May stared at the phone screen, David's contact photo blurring through tears she refused to shed. But as her vision cleared, something clicked into place, a detail that transformed her despair into blazing clarity. You made a mistake, she said, looking up at Hartwell with newfound steel in her voice. His eyebrows rose with mild interest. Did we now? David's phone. May held up the device, her archaeological mind finally processing what her grief had missed. He didn't have it when he died. It was never found with his body. The silence that followed felt charged with electricity. Dr. Rodriguez's sharp intake of breath confirmed that May's mentor understood the implications immediately. Carlson shifted uncomfortably, his confident demeanor flickering. Which means, May continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, David didn't kill himself. You killed him, and you've had his phone for 3 months, probably using it to cover your tracks. maybe even to lure other victims. Hartwell's mask of patient authority slipped completely. That's quite an accusation from a grieving widow with emotional problems. "I'm an archaeologist," May shot back, standing straighter despite the baby's weight. "I know the difference between evidence and coincidence. David's gambling debts, his supposed suicide, even my winning this storage unit, none of it was random, was it?" The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. David hadn't been weak, he'd been targeted. His gambling problems had made him vulnerable, easy to manipulate into debt with the wrong people. When he'd discovered something, maybe stumbled across evidence of Hartwell's burial sites during one of his construction jobs, they'd eliminated him and staged it as suicide. "You used his death to isolate me," May realized aloud. "Made sure I was broke, desperate enough to bid on storage units I couldn't afford. You wanted me to find this place." Dr. Rodriguez stepped closer, understanding dawning in her eyes. They needed someone with archaeological expertise to properly identify what they'd buried, to tell them if they'd missed anything important. "Exactly." May felt a grim satisfaction as Hartwell's expression darkened. "You've been playing clean-up for 20 years, but you're not archaeologists. You didn't know if you'd properly disposed of evidence, if there were artifacts worth enough money to bring serious investigators. You needed someone trained to evaluate the site." Carlson cleared his throat nervously. "This is all very creative, but nothing." May's voice cut through his protest like a blade. "You made me an expert witness to your own crimes. Everything we've documented, every photograph Dr. Rodriguez uploaded, every GPS coordinate and soil sample, it's all evidence now, not just of the burial chamber, but of your involvement." The baby kicked forcefully, as if responding to May's surge of adrenaline. She pressed her hand to the spot, feeling her child's movement as a reminder of what she was really fighting for. Not just justice for David or the unknown victims, but the right to bring new life into a world where truth mattered more than power. "You're forgetting something important," Hartwell said, his voice losing all pretense of politeness. "Evidence requires living witnesses." "No." May pulled up the photo gallery on her phone, showing him the screen. "Evidence requires documentation, and we've documented everything. Timestamps, coordinates, your face, your threats, your admission that this isn't your first time handling problems." Dr. Rodriguez held up her own device. "Cloud storage is a wonderful thing. Multiple servers, automatic backup, university IT security that's designed to preserve research data indefinitely." May watched Hartwell's face cycle through emotions, frustration, calculation, and finally a cold resignation that terrified her more than his earlier threats. A desperate man might make mistakes, create opportunities for escape. But this expression spoke of methodical efficiency, the look of someone preparing to complete an unpleasant but necessary task. "Then we'll have to be more thorough than usual," he said simply. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, but May felt something unexpected, relief. The waiting was over, the pretense had ended. Whatever happened next would be honest violence rather than psychological manipulation. She gripped the trowel tighter, feeling its inadequate weight against impossible odds, but she'd exposed the truth, forced them to abandon their careful plans, created evidence that would outlast whatever they did to her. David's real story would be told. Their child's death, if it came, would mean something. "Dr. Rodriguez," May said quietly, never taking her eyes off Hartwell, "thank you for believing me, for helping me find the truth." Her mentor's hand found her shoulder one last time. "Thank you for showing me what courage looks like." The baby kicked again, stronger now, as if responding to its mother's heartbeat. May realized that her greatest fear had never been death after all. It had been powerlessness, being another forgotten victim of circumstances beyond her control. But she wasn't powerless anymore. She was dangerous. She was witnessed. She was remembered. And that changed everything. The sound that cut through the morning air wasn't what any of them expected. The sharp blast of a car horn, followed by the crunch of gravel under multiple vehicles. Hartwell's head snapped toward the storage unit entrance, his controlled demeanor fracturing for the first time. Expecting company? Dr. Rodriguez asked, hope creeping into her voice. May's heart hammered against her ribs as voices carried across the storage facility, young voices calling her mentor's name. Recognition flooded through her as she heard Sarah Chen's distinctive laugh, followed by Marcus Webb's booming greeting. Dr. Rodriguez? We brought coffee and those soil analysis kits you wanted. Hartwell's eyes blazed with fury as he turned to Carlson. You said you handled the university. I did, Carlson hissed back, pulling out his phone. They weren't supposed to. Professor Rodriguez? Another voice, closer now. Your car's here, but the storage unit number you texted doesn't match what May gave us yesterday. May felt a surge of fierce gratitude. Her former colleagues had come looking, drawn by the inconsistencies that Hartwell's people had created in their attempts at deception. The same attention to detail that made them good archaeologists had just become their salvation. Here, Dr. Rodriguez shouted before anyone could stop her. Unit 47, we need help. Hartwell lunged toward her, but May stepped between them, swinging the trowel in a wild arc that caught him across the knuckles. He cursed, stumbling backward into the gravel, and May felt a savage satisfaction as ancient pottery shards scattered under his weight, evidence literally ground into his clothes, his skin, his presence at this site. Run, May gasped to Dr. Rodriguez, but her mentor was already moving, not toward the exit but toward her camera, snatching it up while shouting updates to the approaching students. Call Sheriff Martinez. Tell him we found the Clearwater burial site. Tell him Hartwell Construction is involved. The irony wasn't lost on May that Sheriff Martinez had probably been compromised too, but it didn't matter anymore. Too many witnesses were arriving too quickly for Hartwell's people to contain. The careful orchestration of the morning was dissolving into chaos that favored the innocent over the guilty. Carlson made a desperate grab for Dr. Rodriguez's camera, but May threw her full weight against him, her pregnant belly becoming an unexpected weapon. He recoiled instinctively, unwilling to strike a visibly pregnant woman in front of witnesses, and that moment of hesitation cost him everything. Sarah Chen appeared in the doorway, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm as she took in the scene. May disheveled and breathing hard, strangers in expensive clothes grappling with her beloved professor over camera equipment, and most telling of all, the carefully excavated artifacts scattered throughout the storage unit. Oh my God, Sarah breathed, her graduate student brain immediately cataloguing the significance of what she was seeing. Dr. Rodriguez, these pottery fragments, they're Blackfoot, aren't they? Pre-contact Blackfoot? Document everything, Dr. Rodriguez commanded, her academic authority reasserting itself as more students crowded into the entrance. Marcus, start GPS mapping. Sarah, photograph the soil stratification. This is an active crime scene. May watched Hartwell's face cycle through emotions as his carefully controlled situation spiraled beyond recovery. Too many phones were out now, too many cameras clicking, too many young archaeologists who understood exactly what they were looking at and why it mattered. The burial chamber that had been hidden for centuries and then violated for decades was finally receiving the protection it deserved. This isn't over, Hartwell said quietly, his words meant for May alone. But May felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the solid ground of community beneath her feet, Sarah's protective arm around her shoulders, Marcus already on his phone with proper authorities, Dr. Rodriguez directing the documentation with fierce precision. These were her people, her chosen family, the ones who understood that truth was worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Yes, it is, May replied, one hand on her belly where their child was kicking with what felt like celebration. You just don't know it yet. The baby had been active all morning, but now the movements felt different, less like distress, more like anticipation, as if even her unborn child understood that they had survived the worst of it, that whatever came next would happen in daylight with witnesses and documentation and people who cared whether they lived or died. May looked around the storage unit one last time, seeing it not as a trap, but as the place where she had finally stopped running from David's legacy and started building her own. The pottery shards glinted in the morning light like promises kept, ancient voices finally being heard, modern secrets finally being exposed. She was an archaeologist again. She was dangerous again. She was no longer alone. And that changed everything. 3 hours later, May sat in the passenger seat of Sarah's Honda, watching Cedar Falls unfold through the windshield like a map she was finally learning to read. Every familiar street corner now carried new weight. The hardware store where Hartwell probably bought his tools, the diner where Carlson had his morning coffee, the bank where David's construction loans had been approved with suspicious ease. "You don't have to go back to the house," Sarah said for the third time, glancing at May's profile with concern. "My apartment has a pull-out couch. It's not much, but—" "I need to see it," May interrupted softly. "All of it, with new eyes." The baby had been quiet since they'd left the storage facility, as if exhausted by the morning's drama. May pressed her hand to the spot where she'd felt those celebratory kicks earlier, drawing comfort from the solid warmth beneath her palm. They'd made it through the immediate danger, but Hartwell's parting words echoed in her mind like a promise of storm still coming. Dr. Rodriguez had stayed behind to coordinate with the legitimate authorities, a state archaeologist and FBI agents who'd arrived within hours of the university's call. The speed of their response suggested May's discoveries had connected dots in investigations she'd never known existed. 20 years of missing persons, 20 years of unexplained construction projects, 20 years of families who'd never gotten answers about their loved ones. "Turn left here," May directed as they approached her street. The house looked exactly the same. David's truck still parked in the driveway, the gutters still hanging loose from last month's windstorm, the mailbox still bearing both their names in faded vinyl letters. But everything felt different now that she understood the true story behind their life here. David hadn't been weak. He'd been murdered for stumbling across something that powerful men needed to keep buried. His gambling debts hadn't been personal failure. They'd been deliberate manipulation, a way to isolate him, make him vulnerable, ensure that his eventual death would look like predictable tragedy rather than calculated elimination. "May," Sarah's voice carried gentle warning. "You're gripping the door handle hard enough to leave marks." May forced her fingers to relax, but the tension in her chest remained. She was committed now, to finishing what David had unknowingly started, to following every lead the storage unit had revealed, to making sure that every victim got the justice they deserved. But commitment came with consequences, and those consequences were just beginning to unfold. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Nice work today. But you're still thinking too small." May stared at the screen, her blood chilling as she recognized the pattern. Not Hartwell this time. The tone was different, more intellectual. Someone else, someone who'd been watching the morning's events with interest rather than alarm. "What is it?" Sarah asked, noticing May's expression. Before May could answer, another message appeared. "Check David's toolbox. Third drawer down. Look for what he kept but never told you about." May's hands trembled as she forwarded the messages to Dr. Rodriguez, then to the FBI contact number she'd been given. But even as she followed protocol, questions multiplied in her mind. How many people were involved in this network? How many had been watching her for months, manipulating her grief, orchestrating her discovery of truths that someone wanted revealed? The house keys felt foreign in her hands as they approached the front door. May had left this morning as a desperate widow clinging to archaeological skills she thought she'd abandoned. She was returning as someone who'd stared down killers and lived to document their crimes. The transformation should have felt empowering, but instead, it felt like stepping across a threshold she could never uncross. "I'll check the rooms," Sarah offered, but May shook her head. "No. I need to do this myself." David's workshop occupied the converted garage, his tools still arranged with the precision of a man who'd respected his craft. May had avoided this space since his death, unable to face the reminder of projects left unfinished, dreams abandoned. Now she approached the familiar red toolbox with archaeological focus, treating it as she would any site that might contain evidence. The third drawer stuck slightly, warped by months of temperature changes. When it finally opened, May found herself staring at a collection of photographs, GPS coordinates, and handwritten notes in David's careful script. Documentation of burial sites, records of human remains discovered during construction projects, evidence of a pattern that stretched back years before his death. At the bottom of the drawer, wrapped in an oil-stained cloth, lay a small pottery fragment that matched the pieces she'd found that morning. David had kept his own evidence, his own proof of what Hartwell Construction was covering up. He'd been building a case, gathering documentation, preparing to expose the truth. And it had gotten him killed. May sank into David's work chair, finally understanding the full scope of what she'd committed herself to finishing. This wasn't just about one storage unit or one burial site. It was about systematic destruction of evidence, decades of covered-to-up crimes, a network of corruption that reached into every institution she'd hoped might protect her. The baby kicked once, firmly, as if reminding May that some fights were worth whatever they cost. May spread David's documentation across his workbench, her archaeologist's training taking over as she organized the evidence with methodical precision. Photographs of disturbed soil, GPS coordinates marked in red ink, handwritten notes describing fragments found and quickly reburied. Her husband had been conducting his own investigation for months before his death. The anonymous text had been right. She'd been thinking too small. This wasn't about Hartwell Construction covering up a few accidental discoveries. David's records painted a picture of systematic looting, with construction projects deliberately targeting known burial sites. The pottery fragment he'd saved matched not just the pieces from the storage unit, but artifacts that appeared in several photographs, labeled with different locations across 3 counties. May? Sarah's voice carried from the kitchen, but May couldn't tear herself away from the emerging pattern. A map of Cedar Falls and the surrounding area hung above David's workbench, dotted with colored pushpins that she'd always assumed marked job sites. Now she recognized them as burial locations, some marked in blue for protected, others in red for compromised. The red pins outnumbered the blue by more than 3 to 1. Her phone buzzed again. "You're beginning to understand the scope." David was close to exposing everything when he became inconvenient. May's hands shook as she typed back, "Are you?" The response came immediately. Someone who's been waiting 20 years for an archaeologist brave enough to finish what others started. Another message followed. Check the last page of his notebook. The one hidden behind the false back of the drawer. May's fingers found the slight irregularity in the drawer's construction, pressing until a hidden panel slid aside. Inside lay a leather notebook she'd never seen, its pages filled with David's handwriting growing increasingly urgent toward the end. The final entry was dated 3 days before his death. "They know I have evidence. Hartwell called today, offered to buy out my contract for double rate. When I refused, Carlson suggested my gambling debts could be restructured if I stayed quiet. May's pregnant. I can't put her at risk, but I can't let this continue. Meeting with Sheriff Martinez tomorrow. If something happens to me, the evidence is hidden where only May would think to look. She'll know what to do." The workshop door creaked behind her. May spun, expecting Sarah, but found herself facing a stranger. A woman in her 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes that held a familiar intensity. "Dr. Elizabeth Warren," the woman said, extending her hand. "I sent the texts." May's mind raced, placing the name. Dr. Warren had been a legend in regional archaeology, the one who'd first mapped the Blackfoot burial sites in this area. She'd disappeared from academic circles 20 years ago after a highly publicized dispute with the State Archaeological Commission. "You're supposed to be dead," May said, the pieces clicking into place. "Easier that way. Gave me freedom to investigate without worrying about tenure or funding or people who preferred certain truths stay buried." Dr. Warren moved to the workbench, her gaze taking in David's organized evidence with professional appreciation. "Your husband was a good man. He died because he cared more about justice than his own safety. You've been watching me. It wasn't a question. Since the day you moved here. David wasn't the first construction worker to stumble across evidence, but he was the first with integrity and a wife trained to understand what he'd found. When they killed him, I knew they'd eventually use you too. May felt the baby's movement, a flutter of life that reminded her what was at stake. The storage unit. You made sure I'd win it. I influenced the auction, yes. But everything you discovered, every connection you made, that was your skill, your courage. Dr. Warren pulled a thick folder from her jacket. This contains evidence from 19 other sites. Photographs, soil samples, documentation of artifacts that was supposed to be preserved, but instead were sold to private collectors. David's work fills in the final pieces. The scope was staggering. Not just grave robbing, but systematic cultural destruction spanning decades. Indigenous artifacts worth millions funneled through a network that reached from local construction companies to international antiquities dealers. The burial chamber in the storage unit wasn't an anomaly, it was a warehouse, a way station for stolen history. Why now? May asked. Why reveal everything today? Because Hartwell's getting sloppy, desperate. Your discovery this morning scared him into making mistakes. He's already reaching out to his contacts, trying to liquidate assets, cover tracks. If we move fast, we can expose the entire network before they scatter. May's phone rang. Dr. Rodriguez, calling with updates from the storage facility. But as she reached for it, May caught sight of movement outside the workshop window. A familiar truck was pulling into her driveway, engine running, windows tinted too dark to see inside. Dr. Warren, May said quietly, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. I don't think we're going to have the luxury of moving fast. The truck's engine shut off, and May heard the distinctive sound of multiple doors opening. Hartwell hadn't given up after all. He'd simply regrouped, gathered reinforcements, and followed the same anonymous guidance that had led Dr. Warren to her door. The final test was beginning. The workshop's single overhead bulb cast harsh shadows as May counted the footsteps approaching, at least 3 sets, moving with military precision across her gravel driveway. Dr. Warren was already in motion, snatching David's notebook and shoving it into May's hands with urgent efficiency. Back door, Warren whispered. But May shook her head, her archaeologist's mind calculating angles and escape routes with the same methodical precision she'd once used to map excavation sites. They'll have someone waiting. This is Hartwell's town. He knows every exit. May's hand found the familiar weight of her excavation hammer in David's tool belt, muscle memory overriding 7 months of pregnancy-induced caution. Besides, I'm done running. The front door exploded inward with enough force to rattle the workshop walls. May heard Sarah's terrified scream from the kitchen, followed by Hartwell's voice, colder than she'd ever heard it. Find them, now. Dr. Warren pressed something hard and rectangular into May's palm, a GPS device, its screen showing dozens of red dots scattered across the county. Every burial site they've desecrated, every crime scene they've covered. Get this to the FBI contact Rodriguez gave you. What about you? I've been dead for 20 years, remember? Time to make that official. Warren's smile held 20 years of accumulated rage. I'll buy you time. The workshop door shuddered under heavy impacts. May moved on instinct, her pregnant body finding angles and leverage points that shouldn't have been possible. The workbench's heavy drawers became barriers. David's tool cabinets transformed into obstacles that would slow but not stop armed men. The baby was kicking frantically now, responding to May's elevated heart rate with movements that felt almost like encouragement. Fight, the kick seemed to say. Survive. The door splintered. Carlson came through first, gun drawn, his expensive suit incongruous with the calculated violence in his movements. Behind him, 2 men May didn't recognize. Hired muscle, their faces carrying the flat professionalism of people accustomed to making problems disappear permanently. Dr. May Blackwood, Hartwell's voice preceded him into the room, casual conversational tone, at odds with the destruction surrounding them. Still playing archaeologist, I see. May stepped forward, positioning herself between the armed men and Dr. Warren. Her excavation hammer held low but ready. The weight felt familiar in her hands, a tool she'd used thousands of times to reveal buried truths. Still murdering people who threaten your profit margins, I see. Hartwell's laugh carried genuine amusement. You think this is about money? May, you've been thinking like an academic when you should have been thinking like a businesswoman. This town exists because we made it exist. These roads, these buildings, these jobs, all built on land that had to be cleared, prepared, developed. Sometimes that process involves inconvenient discoveries. Inconvenient people too, May shot back, thinking of David's final notebook entry. Like my husband. David was offered a very generous solution to his gambling debts. He chose righteousness over pragmatism. Hartwell's tone suggested he found this choice incomprehensible. You, however, still have options. May felt Dr. Warren shift behind her, recognizing the older woman's tension as she prepared for whatever desperate gambit she'd planned. The workshop suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing closer as armed men positioned themselves to eliminate any chance of escape. What kind of options? May asked, buying time while her mind catalogued potential weapons, David's power tools, the heavy equipment, the scattered pottery shards that could blind an attacker if thrown with sufficient force. Join the family business. Your archaeological expertise would be invaluable for pre-development site assessment. Identify burial locations before construction begins. Help us work around them more efficiently. Very lucrative, very private consulting work. The baby's kicks intensified, and May realized she was unconsciously pressing her hand to her belly in a protective gesture. Hartwell noticed too, his smile shifting to something that made her skin crawl. Your child could grow up in Cedar Falls with every advantage we can provide. Excellent schools, guaranteed college admission, trust fund that would set them up for life. All it requires is your professional discretion about certain archaeological irregularities. May understood the subtext perfectly. Accept their offer and become complicit in cultural destruction, or refuse and join David in permanent silence. But Hartwell had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed May's pregnancy made her more vulnerable, when in reality it had made her infinitely more dangerous. You're right about one thing, May said, shifting her grip on the excavation hammer. I have been thinking like an academic instead of a businesswoman. She smiled, feeling David's presence like a hand on her shoulder, his love and courage flowing through her as she prepared to finish what he'd started. Lucky for me, archaeologists are trained to fight for the dead. May raised the hammer, and the world exploded into motion. The hammer caught Carlson's gun hand with archaeological precision, the same controlled force May had once used to extract delicate artifacts from compressed earth. His weapon clattered across the concrete floor as Dr. Warren rolled behind David's table saw, shouting coordinates into a phone May hadn't seen her pull. GPS shows 47.2734, 114.8564. Multiple hostiles, shots fired. May threw herself sideways as the hired muscle opened fire, David's heavy toolbox providing cover while plaster exploded from the workshop walls. The baby kicked frantically, responding to her adrenaline with movements that felt like panic. She pressed her back against the workbench, breathing hard, calculating angles and distances with the methodical precision that had made her exceptional at mapping burial sites. But precision meant nothing if she couldn't protect what mattered most. Hartwell's voice cut through the gunfire, calm as a boardroom presentation. Dr. Warren, your 20-year investigation ends here. May, your child's future depends on the next 60 seconds. May's hand found David's cordless drill, its battery indicator still showing green. She thought of the pottery shards scattered across her kitchen table that morning, each piece a fragment of someone's sacred history, someone's murdered ancestor. Of David's careful documentation, his courage in the face of threats she'd never known he was receiving. of the baby growing inside her, innocent life that deserved a world where truth mattered more than profit. "The artifacts," May called out, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "The burial chamber in the storage unit. How many others are there?" "Dozens," Hartwell replied, moving closer to her position with predatory patience. "Cedar Falls sits on one of the richest archaeological sites in Montana. We've been careful stewards, extracting cultural resources before development could damage them. Very profitable stewardship." May closed her eyes, seeing David's map with perfect clarity, blue pins for protected sites, red pins for compromised ones. The pattern hadn't been random destruction. It had been systematic harvesting, cultural genocide disguised as responsible development. The drill's motor screamed as May triggered it, emerging from cover in a movement that combined pregnancy-shifted balance with archaeological field experience. She aimed, not for Hartwell, but for the workshop's electrical panel, the spinning bit cutting through safety switches and main feeds with shower of sparks that plunged half the building into darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in hellish red that made targeting impossible. May heard Dr. Warren moving, her 70-year-old body navigating David's workshop layout with surprising agility. Glass shattered, the window above the back workbench, creating a second exit route. "May," Warren's voice from outside. "The GPS device. Everything depends on—" The gunshot cut her words short. May's stomach clenched with more than pregnancy as she realized Dr. Warren had just made the sacrifice she'd spoken about, buying time with her life, ensuring that 20 years of evidence would reach people who could act on it. May's fingers closed around the GPS unit, its screen still glowing with red dots that represented decades of desecrated burial sites. Each dot was someone's ancestor, someone's sacred space violated for profit. Each dot was justice delayed but not denied. Carlson's flashlight beam swept across her position. May realized she had perhaps 30 seconds before they flanked her completely, 30 seconds to choose between her own survival and ensuring the evidence reached safety. The calculation was archaeological in its clarity. Some discoveries were worth any risk to preserve. The baby kicked once, firmly, as if offering permission. May pulled David's phone from his tool belt, fingers flying over the screen as she uploaded every photo from the GPS device to the cloud storage account Dr. Rodriguez had set up that morning. Burial site coordinates, artifact documentation, victim identification records, 20 years of evidence streaming into FBI databases while Hartwell's men closed in. "Upload complete," the phone announced in David's familiar voice settings. May smiled, tasting blood where she'd bitten her lip during the fall. David's voice, speaking words that would finally bring justice for his murder and vindication for his courage. The baby's movements had calmed, as if sensing that the critical moment had passed. Hartwell appeared around the workbench, gun drawn, his expression showing the first cracks in his controlled facade. "You have no idea what you've just destroyed." 20 years of cultural destruction, May replied, struggling to her feet with one hand protecting her belly. Decades of covered-up murders, a network of thieves hiding behind development permits. A way of life. Jobs, prosperity, progress. Hartwell's voice carried genuine grief. "This town will die without the construction contracts. Families will lose everything." May thought of the red pins on David's map, of burial chambers turned into storage units, of sacred artifacts sold to private collectors who would never understand their true value. Some things matter more than profit. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. May pressed both hands to her belly, feeling strong kicks that seemed to celebrate rather than protest. She had sacrificed her safety, her anonymity, her quiet grief, but she had saved her child's future and honored David's memory. The victory belonged to the dead, as it should. The first FBI agents burst through the splintered workshop door 43 minutes later, finding May sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor with her back against David's workbench, both hands cradling her belly while she spoke quietly to the baby about its father's courage. Hartwell and his surviving men had vanished the moment the sirens became impossible to ignore, leaving behind scattered evidence and blood that wasn't May's. Agent Sarah Chen, young, intense, wearing a bulletproof vest over her FBI windbreaker, knelt beside May with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Blackwood, are you injured? Do we need medical assistance?" "The baby's fine," May said, her voice carrying exhaustion that went deeper than the night's violence. "Kicking like it wants to help with the investigation." Chen's smile was brief but genuine. "Dr. Rodriguez is en route with the full archaeological crimes unit. The evidence you uploaded is already being processed. GPS coordinates are directing recovery teams to burial sites across 3 counties. May closed her eyes, seeing Dr. Warren's final sacrifice with the clarity that came after adrenaline faded. The older woman had bought justice with her life, ensuring 20 years of evidence would survive even if its discoverers didn't. "Dr. Warren?" "Found her by the back window. She didn't make it, but there's a phone in her hand with an active call to our field office. Her final testimony is on record." Chen's expression hardened. Her death won't be in vain. Through the broken workshop door, May could see the controlled chaos of a federal crime scene unfolding in her driveway. Floodlights transformed the October darkness into artificial day while agents photographed everything, collected shell casings, documented the systematic destruction of David's carefully organized evidence. Her quiet home had become the epicenter of what the news would later call the largest archaeological crimes investigation in Montana history. "Hartwell?" May asked, though she already knew the answer from Chen's expression. "Gone, but not invisible. Your evidence includes financial records, communication logs, shipping manifests. We'll track him and his network through every transaction, every payment, every artifact they moved." Chen helped May to her feet with careful attention to her pregnancy. "The construction company assets are already frozen. Bank accounts, equipment, properties, everything." May felt the baby's movement shift from agitated kicking to something that almost felt like contentment, as if the child could sense that the immediate danger had passed. But contentment felt premature when Hartwell remained free, when the full scope of the destruction was still being calculated, when David's murder was just one crime in a decades-long pattern of violence. "The storage unit," May said, remembering the burial chamber that had started everything, the artifacts, the remains, secured under federal protection. Dr. Rodriguez's team will oversee proper repatriation to the Blackfoot Nation. The ancestors you found will finally receive the dignity they were denied." Chen's voice carried professional satisfaction. "Your archaeological documentation ensured we could preserve the cultural context. That matters more than you might realize." May thought about David's notebook, his careful records of what he'd discovered and why it mattered enough to die for. His final entry had been about protecting his pregnant wife, but his evidence had protected something larger, the cultural heritage of people whose voices had been silenced by profit and greed. Agent Chen guided her toward the workshop door, past David's scattered tools and Dr. Warren's blood on the concrete floor. Outside, the October air carried the sharp promise of snow, winter arriving early to blanket Cedar Falls in clean white that would hide the scars left by 20 years of systematic destruction. "What happens now?" May asked, one hand unconsciously tracing the curve of her belly where the baby had settled into calmer movement. "Recovery, investigation, justice." Chen's tone suggested certainty, but May had learned too much about hidden truths to accept easy answers. "And you start over somewhere safe while we build the cases that will dismantle this network permanently." May looked back at her home, David's home, where they'd planned to raise their child in small-town safety. The illusion of security had been shattered as completely as the workshop door, but something more valuable had emerged from the destruction. Truth, justice, the knowledge that some principles were worth any sacrifice to preserve. The baby kicked once, gently, as if agreeing with thoughts May couldn't voice. Tomorrow would bring federal protection, witness testimony, media attention that would transform her quiet grief into public vindication. But tonight, in the aftermath of violence and revelation, May felt only profound exhaustion and the deep satisfaction that came from finishing what David had started. She had honored her husband's courage, protected their child's future, and ensured that the dead, both ancient and recent, would finally have their stories told. The immediate conflict was over, but May understood that recovery would take much longer than a single night. Still, for the first time since David's death, she felt ready to begin. The return. 3 months later, May stood in the doorway of her new apartment in Missoula, watching snow fall past the kitchen window while her daughter, Emma Rose, named for David's grandmother, slept peacefully in the carrier strapped to her chest. The morning light was softer here, filtered through university buildings instead of construction sites, carrying the sounds of students rather than heavy machinery. It was the kind of quiet David would have appreciated. Another box from the bureau. Her neighbor called from the hallway, wheeling in a package marked with official seals. May had grown accustomed to these deliveries, recovered artifacts being returned to their rightful tribal representatives, evidence photographs for the ongoing prosecutions, updates on the investigation that had sprawled into a federal task force spanning 4 states. Emma stirred at the sound, tiny fingers grasping reflexively. May touched her daughter's perfect hand, marveling as she did every morning at how much courage such small fingers could inspire. Emma had been born during the 3rd week of testimony, her first cry coinciding almost perfectly with the guilty verdict in Hartwell's federal trial. David would have found the timing poetic. May's phone buzzed with a text from Agent Chen, final sentencing today. Thought you'd want to know. She did want to know, but not with the desperate urgency that had once consumed her. Justice was proceeding with federal thoroughness, Hartwell facing life without parole, his network dismantled, over 40 burial sites secured for proper repatriation. Dr. Warren's sacrifice had exposed a criminal enterprise that stretched back 25 years, validating every risk she and David had taken. But May had learned to measure victory differently now. It lived in Emma's steady breathing, in the letter of acceptance from the University of Montana's anthropology department, where she would begin teaching in the fall, in the fact that she could walk down a street without checking for surveillance or calculating escape routes. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive was finally fading into something resembling peace. Dr. Rodriguez knocked softly before entering, carrying coffee and the morning newspaper. The older woman had become an unexpected friend during the long months of testimony, a steady presence a bridge between May's old life and whatever came next.
"How are my favorite ladies this morning?"
"Surviving," May said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Emma slept 4 hours straight. I'm calling it a miracle. You both look stronger." Rodriguez settled into the chair David had liked best, the one piece of furniture May had insisted on keeping from their Cedar Falls home. The prosecutor called yesterday. The final civil suits are settling. The victim families will receive substantial compensation from the seized assets. May nodded, thinking of the faces she'd seen during the trials. Siblings of the missing, parents who had searched for decades, children who had grown up without ever knowing what happened to their loved ones. David's careful documentation had given them answers, even when those answers came wrapped in grief. "Will it be enough?" "Justice is rarely enough," Rodriguez said quietly, "but it's what we can offer." Emma opened her eyes, David's eyes, impossibly blue and already showing signs of the curiosity that had driven her father to document hidden truths. May lifted her daughter from the carrier, settling into the familiar rhythm of feeding while watching snow accumulate on unfamiliar streets. This was healing too, she realized, the ordinary moments that comprised a life rebuilt from catastrophe. "I've been thinking about the teaching position," May said, "about whether I'm ready to stand in front of students and pretend I have answers about preserving cultural heritage when I couldn't even protect my husband." Rodriguez leaned forward, her expression carrying the professional gentleness May remembered from their first meeting. "You think those students need someone who's never faced real consequences for pursuing truth? May, you survived 25 years of systematic destruction with both your principles and your child intact. That's exactly the kind of strength future archaeologists need to see." May looked down at Emma, who was watching the snow with the focused attention of someone discovering the world one detail at a time. Her daughter would grow up knowing her father's story, understanding that some principles were worth any sacrifice to preserve, learning that courage could be measured in careful documentation as much as dramatic gestures. "The Blackfoot Council sent something," Rodriguez continued, pulling an envelope from her jacket. "They wanted you to have it before the final repatriation ceremony." Inside was a photograph of the burial chamber May had discovered in the storage unit, but transformed. The artifacts were arranged according to traditional protocols, the remains honored with ceremony that had been delayed for a century. At the bottom, handwriting in English and Blackfoot, for the archaeologist who remembered that the dead deserved dignity. "Your husband's courage lives in this healing." May pressed the photograph to her chest, feeling Emma's small weight against her arms and David's presence like sunlight through winter glass. She had returned to the world of ordinary mornings and academic concerns, but she carried something new within her, the unshakable knowledge that when principles and survival came into conflict, she would choose principles every time. That was David's true inheritance to their daughter, not money or property, but the understanding that some things mattered more than safety, more than comfort, more than life itself. Emma smiled, her first real smile, as if she already understood. May felt time shift around that first smile, as if Emma's tiny expression had unlocked something that had been waiting since David's death. The apartment seemed brighter suddenly, the weight of the past months settling into memory rather than immediate pain. Rodriguez quietly slipped out, understanding that some moments belonged only to family, even a family reduced to two. "Your daddy would have fallen completely apart at that smile," May whispered, lifting Emma to the window where snow continued its gentle descent over Missoula. "He practiced diaper changing on every archaeological doll we could find, but he never figured out how to handle the crying without panicking." Emma's smile widened, her blue eyes tracking the snowflakes with David's methodical attention to detail. May could already see hints of her husband's curiosity in the way their daughter studied the world, examining each new site with the focus that had made him an exceptional researcher. But there was something else too, a calm resilience that May hoped came from surviving so much before even being born. The phone rang, Agent Chen's name appearing on the screen. May answered while bouncing Emma gently, the multitasking of new motherhood becoming second nature. "Good morning, Sarah." "Final chapter," Chen said simply. "Hartwell got life plus 40 years. No possibility of parole. His appeals are already being denied." "It's over, May." May sank into David's chair, feeling Emma's weight against her chest like an anchor to the present moment. Justice was a strange thing. It arrived so quietly after months of anticipation. No dramatic revelation, no cinematic satisfaction, just a phone call confirming that a dangerous man would never hurt anyone else. How do I feel relieved and empty at the same time? "Because closure doesn't bring back the people we lost," Chen said, "but it honors what they died protecting." Dr. Warren's testimony led to 17 federal indictments. David's documentation prevented the destruction of sacred sites across 4 states. That matters. After the call ended, May sat in David's chair holding their daughter, while snow transformed the university campus into something pristine and hopeful. She thought about the storage unit that had started everything, tons of gravel hiding artifacts and murder, a random auction bid that had unraveled 25 years of systematic destruction. The archaeologist in her understood that some discoveries happened by accident, but surviving them required choice after deliberate choice. Emma's tiny fist closed around May's finger with surprising strength. Such small hands, but they would grow up knowing that courage could be measured in careful documentation, in choosing principles over safety, in protecting the dignity of the dead when the living failed them. May had worried about raising a daughter without a father, but she realized now that David's influence would live in every story she told, every choice she made, every moment she chose truth over convenience. By afternoon, boxes of David's research materials had been transformed into the foundation of May's new office at the university. His notebooks lined one shelf, his photographs another, his careful maps marking both destroyed and protected sites across Montana. The desk where he had worked late into the night documenting Hartwell's crimes would become the place where May taught future archaeologists to recognize when academic work intersected with moral obligation. Emma slept in her carrier while May organized syllabi for her first semester teaching cultural heritage protection. The course title would have made David smile. Abstract concepts given concrete weight by professors who had learned that preserving the past sometimes required risking everything in the present. "Your first lecture," May murmured to her sleeping daughter, "will be about your father's map. Blue pins for protected sites, red pins for compromised ones. You'll learn that patterns tell stories when someone cares enough to document them properly." As evening settled over Missoula, May fed Emma while snow continued falling past the kitchen window. Somewhere in Montana, sacred sites were being restored according to traditional protocols. Somewhere else, families of missing persons were finally holding funerals delayed for decades. And here in this small apartment, a daughter was learning her father's story through her mother's voice. May understood now that survival was not about returning to who she had been before David's murder. The woman who had bid $50 on a storage unit full of gravel was gone, replaced by someone harder and more certain, someone who understood that ordinary people could choose extraordinary courage when principles demanded it. Emma stirred as if sensing her mother's thoughts, blue eyes opening with the alert curiosity that May knew would shape her daughter's entire life. David's eyes, but also her own. The future looking back with hope instead of fear. "Ready to start tomorrow?" May asked softly. Emma's second smile was answer enough, radiant and certain, as if she already understood that some inheritances were worth more than money, that some stories demanded to be continued, and that courage could be passed from parent to child like the most precious gift imaginable. Outside, snow continued falling, covering the world in clean white possibility.